Hey everyone, and this is part 2 of our lecture from Module 2. We're talking about the spirit of 76, the Constitution, and I realize in the last clip that the camera was not pointed directly at my face, so you're only seeing part of me. I apologize for that. But back again, and hopefully we won't have that issue again. I'll try to be watching out for it in the future. So we just talked about the debates that people were having coming up to the Constitution. We talked in the last part about Thomas Paine, Jefferson, a little bit about Madison, and just generally the sort of different sorts of things that people were feeling about government. But broadly, the spirit of 76 was in favor of radical democracy, as we have concluded. So how did this spirit of 76 fare at the Constitutional Convention when the revolution had been achieved? And the observation we should and have to make is that, ironically, in the wake of the Shays Revolt, despite people like Thomas Jefferson having offered sort of rhetorical support for their actions, it is clear that the AntiFederalists were not as victorious as the momentum of the revolution might have suggested. The elite Democrats, people like Madison, as we've said, people like Abigail Adams, were very worried about this question of the disposition of the people. As we were saying, their lack of political maturity, inability to self-govern. For this reason, they advocated strong national government, and they became known as the Federalists. James Madison was probably the most well-known Federalist, and he drafted the first plan of what was to become the U.S. Constitution, and it was known as the Virginia Plan. There were two plans put on the table. The plan envisioned by Madison was for one big United States with a central government that could veto the states, a position that was directly opposed to the Republican ideals of those like Jefferson, who we've been discussing. Now, on the other hand, the New Jersey plan was put forward by William Paterson of New Jersey, and it was to play into the hands of the smaller states. So the sticking point, if we can express it, was to do with the question of representation. Madison's plan was for a strong central government with a bicameral legislature, but it would have been based on the population. So the weightings of the various delegations from the states to the legislature would have been weighted according to population. And you can imagine right there that for that reason, the larger, wealthier states would have had a much greater influence on what was going on in government. Madison also suggested that in his system that the legislature would have had a veto, which meant that it could have vetoed anything going on within the states. So obviously, that's giving a huge amount of power to the federal government, and the states really are sort of following the lead of the federal government. The Anti-Federalists were putting forward a decentralized government plan, right? It was going to be unicameral, but with all the states just having one equal vote. And so that meant that no matter what size the state, they would have the same vote. Now, in the end, as it happens, Madison could not win. There was too much opposition to what he was asking for. And so a great compromise was struck. One house based on representation by population, a second house voted by state legislatures was to be the compromise. And that's pretty much close to at least what we have today, because we have one house based on representation by population, and we have a second house, a Senate, which is no longer voted by state legislatures, but actually that was a change that came later in the history of American politics. When the Senate was first established, it was voted upon by the state legislators. And what that means is that the delegates to the Senate were not voted for by the people, but were voted for by the assemblies within the states, and they would send delegates to the Senate. Also, in the compromise, the federal government would have no veto. So, because of that, the Federalists had to come up with novel ways to keep the legislature in check, because obviously the legislature is going to have a bit more power than they were hoping for. So to prevent the legislature, that is the people, the vote, the voice or the will of the people, gaining too much power, the Federalists were going to demand a strong executive, that is a strong president. And they hoped that also by having the state-voted upper house, that would also be another break. So importantly then, the executive was going to be voted by electors. We sometimes hear when we talk about American elections today about the Electoral College. Well, that's where this comes from. The People's Parliament in other countries like Ireland or Britain, for example, it's their responsibility to vote for the executive. We would tend to call that person something like the Prime Minister. But in the United States, because the executive is going to be housed outside of Parliament, and Parliament's not going to get a say in how the executive is formed, it's going to be an electoral college counting up the votes of the people, but not necessarily bound by the will of the people. And that's an interesting thing that many Americans are still puzzled about today, how it is that Americans do not have a direct vote for the presidency, but rather the electors decide whether or not to go with the will of the people. And 9 times out of 10, of course, they do. Now, we should talk about some of the other issues that were clashed upon at the Constitutional Convention, because already, as we're saying, we have a fairly strong sort of Federalist constitution emerging from the debates. There's 3 other points to consider: the question of property, the question of democracy, and the question of slavery. Now, many of the framers were wealthy people, or they had interests at least that which linked them to the interests of the wealthy classes. Principally, they were owed money from the war, as we've said before. So their view on this is going to be that national government is going to need to have the power to pay public debts, i.e. to pay them, right? So they're owed money from the war, and rather than going to look for that money from the constituent states, they want the federal government to be able to pay those debts. Many of the Anti-Federalists objected to that because they didn't want a sort of financially sophisticated federal government emerging. And we will be discussing more about that in future lectures. The second point, democracy. Well, as we've suggested already, democracy was not a major inspirational value for many of the framers, like Madison. This was not going to be, in the end of the day, the Republic of Paine or Jefferson's Declaration. So there was this strong suspicion of the potential of factionalism or demagoguery, which is, where one fiery speaker whips up the people to sort of a frenzy and starts to motivate them to do things in a way that's poorly reflected on. Adolf Hitler, I suppose, would be a demagogue. So if you have too much democracy, the argument goes, you could potentially lose the country to a demagogue. Then thirdly, on slavery, the northern states wanted to ban the importation of slaves, while southern states did not. And of course, you all know that story. What many people don't know or may have forgotten is that the southern states wanted to kind of have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to have the slaves, but they also wanted to be able to count these slaves as part of their general populations, because that's going to give them more delegates in the House of Representatives. That makes sense to a certain extent, but as I said, they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. And so they were going to not count these people as full citizens. They were going to count them merely as 3/5 of a person, which of course is a completely arbitrary and highly insulting way to value the life of any human being. But that's the system they came up with. Another demand that the slaveholding states were going to put on the table was this idea that the slave trade could not be banned until 1808. So that means that they were going to be able to hold slaves for quite some time, and that the importation of slaves could continue up until 1808. And of course, this really upset a lot of people in the North who were adamantly opposed to slavery. But what else can you do? This is a difficult time to be trying to negotiate these things, and some things are going to have to be left on the shelf. Another point would be that the fugitive slaves, it was agreed, would be returned to their owners. So really that meant that there wasn't even going to be an option to emancipate any of the slaves from the South. They were going to be slaves by definition and by the Constitution, with no chance for emancipation. Of course, you know that this is going to remain a sticking point until decades later in American history. Now, as we move to talk about the ratification of the Constitution, we should note that obviously the Constitution that's emerging, with its principles of radical democracy and representative government, decentralized government, now seems very far away, right? The ideals for which so many people had fought now seem very far away. And there was going to be, as you can imagine, a bitter struggle to get this thing ratified. It was quite federalist in nature. And so it makes sense that even some of the bigger states really balked at it, right? We know that Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia almost didn't pass the Constitution. So it was going to take some fancy footwork on the part of the Federalists to make their case. And they were erudite gentlemen. Interestingly, they were gentlemen and generally not women. One of the means that they would do this was creating a kind of an underground newspaper of sorts, not underground, but a series of pamphlets in a kind of newspaper form called the Federalist Papers, which they were going to circulate as a series of essays and letters written by their authors, Madison, Hamilton, John Jay, using pseudonyms. In these documents, the view on the political life of America is made clear. The preferences for political life in America by the Federalists are made clear. And I'm going to, in the next slide, show you some of the bases for that claim. This is from your textbook, and I think it's just useful, right? Here we see that there's a series of points that are going to distinguish the Federalists from the Anti-Federalists. Now, the major one here is going to be human nature. Madison, as we know, was a cynic on the question of human nature. If men were angels, he once said, no government would be necessary at all. But men are not, of course, angels, so government is necessary. Ordinary people are generally selfish and unenlightened, and he argued that really you needed a lot of education if you're going to practice the self-discipline and self-control, mastery of your emotions that would be necessary to be able to govern. Poor people, women, especially children, all had this quality from Madison's perspective that they were incapable of exercising self-restraint. Okay, and if you let people like that in government, people who are incapable of exercising self-restraint, then you're going to have government and legislation guided by the passions as opposed to the rational mind. So where do you find people with rational minds? Well, you have to turn to the elites, people who have proven through their success that they have acumen to be, for example, businessmen or merchants, these people clearly do have self-control. So these are the people that you want in government, he argues. And so he states that the qualities in man, and I quote, that justify a certain portion of esteem and importance were much more likely to be found in elites. And in contrast with that, the Anti-Federalists had a much different view. They were saying that ordinary people actually were reasonably sophisticated. They had their own ambitions. They know what they wanted in life. They were capable of recognizing, things like art and comfort and quality and civilization. So it follows that they were capable of virtue, right? And moreover, the real dangers for political life were to be found in the ambitions of the upper echelons, right? Because the elites, thinking that they are the ones that should truly be governing everyone, were tending towards corruption in saying that. Without any check on their power, they wouldn't have any reason not to line their own pockets and make government work for themselves first and foremost. So the Anti-Federalists have this very strong response then to the elites. Now, moving on from that then, and as I've said, human nature is the principal issue that they disagree on. The second issue is the scale of political life. Now, the Federalists favored, as I argued earlier on, a large republic, a national government. One of the reasons they wanted that was so that no one group could dominate. Because in a large country, there'd be a number of groups and they would all kind of cancel each other out in some ways, So the Anti-Federalists, however, believed that that was unwieldy, that it created too much distance between the top and the bottom in terms of how the state was governed. You wanted to have the center of government close to the people, and in order to have that, you needed relatively small communities. So what they were arguing for was a series of small states, and that the power should be at the most local level possible, so that it would reflect the preferences of people region by region, right? In politics today, we call this the principle of subsidiarity. The third issue that they disagreed on is the role of representatives. And this is the question, as I argued earlier on, the role of government, really. For Madison and others, the role of government was kind of like to be a teacher, right? To educate people, to lead the people, and make sure that they understood how the world was to be governed. Whereas for the Anti-Federalists, who already trust the people and the people's views, then the job of government is to reflect that and to put those hopes and goals into action. The fourth bone of contention or point of contention is to do with the separation of powers. Now, both sides believed in the separation of powers, but for the Federalists, the particular focus of their concern was on the House of Representatives. You had to keep the passions of the people. Remember, the Federalists didn't believe the people were very well educated or had the ability to govern themselves. So if you let the legislature make all the shots, you're going to end up with bad lawmaking. Conversely, the Anti-Federalists believe that in fact it's the president and the Senate, in other words the elites, that you really have to keep your eye on. So that's a hugely important point, and you can see how, while both sides were expressing a favor of checks and balances, they were deeply suspicious of the agenda of the other side and how the other side was kind of trying to arrange an institutional configuration that would suit their own best interests. So they were mutually suspicious in that regards. Naturally, then, you have, fifthly, a disagreement on the purpose of government itself. For some, the Federalists, it was to protect liberty, and especially private rights, including property. And if you're going to protect private property, and the masses, as we've argued, are these passionate, irrational creatures, then it makes sense that those who are lazy are not going to have a lot of property. They may in fact be dependent on the wealthy for the creation of jobs, for the creation of wealth. And it's natural to think that those people might be looking for a little bit more of the piece of the pie than they deserve. relative to the merits of the work that they've carried out. So in order to make sure that the masses don't come chasing the elites for their wealth, there's going to have to be federal government guarantees of private property rights. For the Anti-Federalists, the view on this was a little bit different. The purpose of government was not so much to protect rights in the sense of property, but to protect political rights, right? And so in order to do that, to make sure that people did not have their economic welfare ripped away from them by rapacious elites, the goal of government would be to make sure that there was a measure of economic justice in the society. And this might involve, for example, what we call today redistribution of wealth. Our final point of contention is to do with long-term stability and change. Now, the stability found in a complex society like the United States, it's important for the country to have an anchor. So how are you going to find this anchor? Well, you're going to use the Constitution to enshrine core values, and you're going to try to create a culture of reverence for the Constitution among the people. Remember, the job of government is to teach the people how to love their country and how to love their Constitution. So, in a sense, then, again, underlining this point that the Federalists didn't really trust the masses on their own to love the Constitution. The Federalists believed that they were the wise ones and that the people needed to be sort of led to this wisdom by those who knew better, right? Well, the Anti-Federalists naturally have a different view to this. They believe that decay and corruption, if they're there, are very much there in the way they're there in Britain or in the Roman Empire, because too much unchecked power among the elites tends to lead to this decadence, right? So a healthy, robust political agitation from below by the masses is the only thing really that can keep the elites in check in this regards. So we move on here to our last lecture, and we talk about the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is an important document. It's a term we use to refer to the first, basically, 10 amendments to the Constitution. And it should be said, if the Federalists won the day in the debate about the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists generally won the day when it comes to thinking about the Bill of Rights. Now, the irony, though, is that it was Madison, actually, perhaps because he felt that he'd achieved his major goals and that he could afford to sort of, as it were, take a hit. Maybe he was persuaded by the Anti-Federalists. Who knows? But it's clear that he did take their wishes very seriously. And so, because the U.S. Constitution didn't seem to have enough basic liberties enshrined in it, it seemed to be very elitist. It seemed to be very much governed from above, putting your trust in the wisdom of the elites. It's important to recognize that the Bill of Rights really did try to change a little bit of that. So, what were the rights that people were worried about? Rights of religious conscience, as you know from earlier on in our last part, were a major concern of the refugees from political persecution in Europe who came to the country in the first place. Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, free expression in the press, and free ability to organize and be active politically were therefore sacred values of the people in the colonies. And Madison was going to recognize that the Constitution, the regime, the republic, whatever you want to call it, is going to have a better chance of surviving and flourishing if these values are represented in the Constitution. Another set of rights is the ability of one to protect oneself in the home. One's private property should be defended from arbitrary seizure. Also, one's private papers should be private, right? So, we talk a lot today about domestic surveillance, and this is one of the reasons why WikiLeaks has been in the news so much of late, because they're revealing information about how the government is contriving with some of the large telecoms and large data service providers like Google and maybe Apple and Microsoft to gather up data about what you and I are doing in our homes and in our private communications. And the Bill of Rights has some views on this, I would argue, because it's supposed to be the case that our correspondences, unless we're under surveillance according to a court warrant, that we have the legitimate right to expect privacy. Another set of rights that are mentioned here are the right to a fair trial, sometimes known as habeas corpus, and freedom from excessive punishment. The punishment should meet the crime, according to the Constitution, according to the Bill of Rights. So clearly these are compromises that give the people back power, give the people back rights. In a constitution that was otherwise very federalist, this is to say that the Anti-Federalists may have at least had an impact through the mechanism of the Bill of Rights. And that, friends, is the end of our lecture for week 2. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in class soon. Take care.